This video is sponsored by the Golden Ticket Warhammer 40,000 event, the Ides of March. More about them later on in the video. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and welcome to another episode of the best armies in Warhammer 40k. This is the weekly video series where we go through undefeated results from the last week of competitive events, talk about what is winning, and break each list down in excruciating detail. Today is for the weekend of February 1st and 2nd, 2025, and it was a pretty big weekend for smaller events, especially around the GT level. So we have a lot of results to discuss. Now, I'm recording this on the road back from the Captain Con GT. I was there streaming all weekend, so if you want to see some of these competitive results, you can check out my stream VODs on the live tab over on my channel, and I want to throw a big shout out to all the folks who watch the games live. But without further ado, let's talk about these results and discuss a metagame breakdown. Now, the Legion of Excess is still buoying up the Chaos Demons faction, with them having the highest number of undefeated results this week. That includes the largest event of the weekend, the Talavera Open 2025, as well as taking down both the Winter Ruin 2, Derg Doom 2, and going XO-1 for first place at the Swiss finals. Now, Space Marines are also doing incredibly well with a wide variety of different Marine lists. This includes Dark Angels at both Nailhammer 7 and the Geek Fest Winter Warzone, Ultramarines at the UTC Invitational Finals, as well as Battle for the Bend 2, Space Marines at Winter Ruin 2, and Space Wolves, interestingly enough, at Tronderholm 2, that with an XO-2 result. 2 draws on that record, and that was using the standard scoring. That wasn't the result of a differential scoring. They just actually went XO-2. Adeptus Custodes took down the Cross Swords PAW, Chaos Knights with the WOG Master 3, Grey Knights at the Black Hole Wars 2025, Chaos Space Marines with the other undefeated result at the Derg Doom 2, Necrons took down Captain Con. Bit of a spoiler alert for my live streams, but that did happen with a nice Starshatter arsenal, as well as Tyranids at the Dice Hammer Open 8. Now, if you want to watch any of that coverage, obviously the #1 place to watch it is my live stream that you can get on my live tab, as we just talked about. But we also saw some other coverage from large events such as the Talavera Open at twitch.tv/El Cobrador del WOG. A smaller event, the Austrian Open, was also streamed by our friends over at Breaking Heads. So if you want to watch some additional coverage from the weekend, check both of those out. I'm going to leave links to both of those streamers down in the video description. And if you have any additional streamers who are live this weekend, go ahead and put them in the comment section so we can get more eyes on their coverage. So with that, let's dive into some of these lists and discussing them in particular. But first, a word from our sponsors.
The Ides of March are approaching, and you should beware of missing the Ides of March GT held by Treasure Trove Keep on March 8th through 9th, 2025. This is the second year that the Ides of March Grand Tournament will be running, and if you are just hearing about it for the first time ever, it is a 100-player GT held up in Rockport, Maine. The event is held at the Samoset Resort, an absolutely gorgeous location, taken from me as someone who was there last year. Oh my god, the location is incredible. You get wonderful views and beautiful weather while you're playing some Warhammer 40k. In addition to a 5-round Warhammer 40k GT, there is also a 100-player AOS event if you're more of a fantasy connoisseur. There is also the Ides of March Golden Brush painting competition that is judged by none other than Goobertown Hobbies. So if you don't want to be a goober yourself, you should head on over to treasuretrovekeep.com/Ides of March 2025 and go get yourself a ticket. I'll also be there at the event live streaming, so you can catch coverage of it here on the channel, but really I would rather see you on camera in person at the tournament. So get your tickets today and I'll see you there.
So we're going to start our journey this week over in Spain at the Talavera Open 2025, an almost 100-player major level event and the largest event of the weekend. This one was won by Gonzalo de la Moneda, running Chaos Demons. This was a Legion of Excess, the Slaanesh-focused detachment that gives you benefits when charging into enemies as long as you give up your capacity to fight first. The army was running Celesk, the Mask of Slaanesh, 2 Contorted Epitomes, 2 Keepers of Secrets, and a Torment Bringer on Exalted Chariot with False Majesty. That enhancement is going to give +1 to wound to all non-monster demons in the vicinity of the Tormentbringer, and the Tormentbringer is also giving you a fight on death effect, which is also pretty synergistic with the detachment ability. 2 contorted epitomes is interesting here. We have 2 units of demonettes, in fact 3 units in total to attach those characters into. They're going to grant you a feel no pain against mortal wounds and allow you to use Thief of Pain to siphon damage on your units over to the demonettes and potentially ignore that with the contorted epitome's leadership ability. We can also protect ourselves from melee counterpunches as well with the Mask of Slaanesh, giving enemies -1 to wound. From there, we also have 2 Slaanesh Soul Grinders as well as 2 units of Fiends. So a lot of what we're going to be doing here is using the Soul Grinders to tank. You cannot Thief of Pain away damage from the Keepers of Secrets. They just have to eat the damage. However, the Soul Grinders are not monsters, so they're able to siphon damage into the demonettes. So they're ridiculously hard to kill with 2 contorted epitomes in the list. So we're basically using these 4 big, huge monsters alongside that detachment ability and the defensive technology that we can use inside /demons to get multiple rounds of super high value attacks out of them. Obviously, that was particularly effective since Gonzalo had an absolutely immense showing. Looks like he only dropped a grand total of 8 points over the course of 6 games, which is absolutely ludicrous result. Now with that, we're going to move over to Canada and talk about the Geek Fest Winter Warzone. This was home to the first of our undefeated Space Marine players, Brendan Valet, who went undefeated with Dark Angels. And not just any Dark Angels, but in fact a Company of Hunters list. This is the mounted and Ravenwing focused detachment that gives you the ability to advance and shoot, advance and charge with your mounted units, giving you an immense amount of threat range with these powerful bikes. This includes Azrael, a chaplain on bike with Master of Maneuver. This allows his unit to set up a battle round earlier out of strategic reserve. We then have 2 additional bike chaplains alongside a lieutenant, a Ravenwing command squad, and Samael. We have a total of 4 units of Outriders. I think these guys are largely acting as utility in this list because we're backing that up with what looks like 3 maximum sized units of Ravenwing Black Knights, alongside 2 scout squads and a dark shroud to protect them all. So we have a lot of options for those characters to hop into. The chaplain on bikes actually have pretty decent synergy with both the Ravenwing Black Knights and the Outriders. They do benefit the Outriders a little bit more in melee, giving them that +1 to wound with their 2 damage melee attacks once they charge, but they can also grant devastating wounds to the twin plasma talons on the Black Knights, which can potentially represent an absolute immense amount of damage from them as well. So a lot of interesting attachment options for those guys. We also then have a little bit of counterpunch here with this big Hellblaster squad, 10 Hellblasters alongside Azrael. He's going to attach in with the lieutenant as well, so we're looking at sustained and lethal hits out of that Hellblaster squad for a ton of damage. Very cool to see Company of Hunters on the table. These detachments are incredibly fast, super good at bullying primary. Clearly that was pretty effective over the course of the weekend. And if you don't have the capacity to deal with these bikes in the early game, you need mass 3 or 4 damage ranged attacks with pretty high AP as well to get through their armor saves, as well as the defensive benefits from things like the Ravenwing Dark Shroud. And if you're not able to clear them out quickly, they're able to play so aggressively that they push you out of any contention on scenario very early. I think it's really easy to underestimate the massive threat range of these armies. The fact that they're mounted means that oftentimes they can't really maneuver as well as you would expect them to, but the fact that they move so quickly means that that's not usually that big of an issue, and they're able to get around corners that you might not expect with that ability to advance and charge. Now with that, we're going to move over to Pennsylvania and talk about the UTC Invitational Finals. This was won by Conan Jennings running Ultramarines, the first of our undefeated Ultramarines we have this time around. This is an Ironstorm Spearhead, which is kind of interesting to see since I know a lot of the focus has been on Gladius Task Force for Ultramarines recently. However, we have seen a couple of good showings from Ironstorm Spearhead as of late, and obviously that's continuing. We're running a Combi Weapon Lieutenant with Master of Machine War, so he's going to allow a vehicle to advance or fall back and still shoot, alongside Marnius Calgar and Robuti Gilliman, the dynamic duo from Ultramarines. A single Intercessor squad, a Company Hero squad for Calgar to hop into, 3 Ballistus Dreadnoughts for some backline long-range shooting, a Scout squad and an Incursor squad for utility to buff up the ranged attacks with their +1 to hit, Hammer Strike Storm Speeder to strip cover from enemies, super duper useful especially for the Ballistus Dreadnoughts, which are kind of middling AP to begin with, and then we also have 3 Vindicators as well. Not too much to say about this list. We've talked quite a bit about the Ironstorm Spearhead and Vindicator-focused varieties of Ultramarines in the past, so I don't know if I really need to reiterate too much going on here, but we have a very high efficiency army. It has a lot of reactive effects. Smokescreen on the Vindicators, Armor of Contempt, reactive shots when you reduce them below half strength, and you can fuel those with Robute Gilliman and Marnius Calgar, who can also act as melee counterpunches when you come in to fight the massive number of 2+ save vehicles that are bearing down the table on you. Overall, very effective archetype, and I'm not surprised that we're seeing it continue to see success. Now we're going to stay in Pennsylvania for a little while and talk about the Winter Ruin 2. This was a relatively large 51-player event, and while it was won by Chaos Demons, who we've already discussed this video, the runner-up was also undefeated at 5-0, and that was none other than Sasha Alexander Edelkraut, who we've actually talked about on this channel before, playing Black Templars or Imperial Fists. Today he has registered Imperial Fists, but he is running a chapter agnostic Marine list. It's not actually belonging to any chapter because it has no particular chapter units inside it. However, it is a very spicy variety of Librarius Conclave. So the Librarian focused attachment where we can cast spells from certain disciplines every battle round and give our army different bonuses depending on the discipline we've chosen. This includes a Librarian with Fusillade, so the anti-monster, anti-vehicle 5-up enhancements to buff up a big unit. It looks like we do have a 10 model Sternguard veteran squad for that guy to jump into. Moving on, we have 2 more standard Librarians as well as a Phobos armor Librarian with Prescience to give his unit a reactive move and a combi weapon lieutenant. We have 2 Impulsors. Those guys are likely to embark a combination of the Hellblaster squad, potentially Incursors, or the 5-man Sternguard veteran squads in order to ferry them up to the fight. We have a single Ballistus Dreadnought for some long-range firepower, the aforementioned Hellblaster squad, as well as 2 Interceptor squads. These guys equipped, one with Assault Bolters, one with Plasma Exterminators, 2 standard Incursor squads to give that bonus to hit to the army, so we're not quite as focused on getting the benefits of Oath of Moment. They also help the Sternguard veterans quite a bit because they allow the Sternguard veterans to potentially fish for sustained hits when using the Fusillade enhancement. We then have 2 5-man Sternguard veteran squads to add a little bit of additional devastating wounds to the army, as well as 2 Vindicators. This gives us a lot of options for devastating damage from the Sternguard veterans. We also have a lot of small individual units that can attach in on those characters. We can potentially get multiple activations out of the Incursors as well by attaching in the Phobos Librarian. That gives them a lone operative effect as well as a reactive move. And while it does strip their scout movement, it does mean that the unit is very difficult to engage with, which is pretty solid. Very unique army this time around. We've seen a lot of varieties of Librarius Conclave get played, but oftentimes they focus more heavily on large bricks with obviously Fusillade. I think that Fusillade unit is basically locked into the build at this point, but we also see things like Terminators, for example, with Celerity to give them advance and charge. Not doing that this time around. We're just playing a more skirmishy style game plan with a lot of these teeny tiny 5-man units who, when combined with the +1 to hit from Incursors, potential hit rerolls of the detachment ability, as well as their own baked in bonuses against Oath of Moment targets, for example, we can get a lot of damage out of these little units, as well as make it very difficult for our opponent to engage into them profitably, since you're going to be largely overcommitting into these small 5-mans in order to actually remove them. Now with that, we're going to move over to Norway for the Trondheim 2. This was a much smaller event with only 22 players, and it was actually won, I guess appropriately for a Norwegian event. It was won by Space Wolves. However, they didn't win with all wins on their record. They in fact had 2 natural draws at the beginning of the event, which is pretty surprising given the fact that we were just using standard scoring, not differential point scoring where draws are more likely. So that's actually very impressive. Leander Carlson went undefeated with this Champions of Rust list. This included 2 Jump Pack Chaplains. We see these guys will give their unit +1 to wound, but they also do some mortal wounds at the start of the fight phase, so we can get some additional value out of those guys. We have a Judiciary with Black Death. That's going to give him anti-monster, anti-vehicle to combo with his built-in devastating wounds for his Executioner Blade. We have a Lieutenant in Phobos armor, Logan Grimnar, Murder Fang, and Ragnar Blackmane. That follows up an Assault Intercessor squad. Usually that's for Ragnar Blackmane to join into, as well as an Impulsor to carry them around the table. We actually have 2 10-man Jump Pack Assault Intercessor squads. These guys will be getting that +1 to wound from the attached Chaplain. They'll get the lethal hits or sustained hits from the detachment ability, potential access to advance and charge, and then when they get in, and if they can get in with a big enough charge, they can do a bunch of mortal wounds on the charge themselves, and then once they activate, the chaplain can also do additional damage with his mortal wounds. So we can get a ton of mortal wounds out of these guys, and having high volume of attacks means that they synergize fairly well with the detachment ability too. We have a big Blade Guard veteran squad that's likely for the Judiciary to jump into, and I guess that can actually hop into the Impulsor as well. We have 5 Enrician Wolves just to act as a utility unit, 2 Gladiator Lancers to punch through opposing enemy armor, an Infiltrator squad to protect against deep strikes, a Reaver squad, and 2 scout squads to act as utility, especially the Reavers there to disrupt enemy objective scoring. Pretty creative list this time around. It's really cool to see these giant jump pack assault intercessor units. That's not really something that we typically see, but clearly pretty effective. And it's cool to see them comboed with the jump pack chaplain, especially now that being able to cleave through units with those mortal wounds into a melee attack, or just be able to punch through saving characteristics with the mass mortal wounds is very useful. It feels like mortal wounds stock has gone up quite a bit in recent times. And so these big assault intercessor bricks trying to push as many mortal wounds through as possible seems pretty effective. Now with that, we're going to move over to the United Kingdom for the Cross Swords PAW 2025. This was won by Cameron Giles, who is running Adeptus Custodes in a Solar Spearhead. This includes a Blade Champion with the Adamantine Talisman to buff up his Interceptor Lance, a Telamon Heavy Dreadnought with Augury Uplink to give it a 5+ Feel No Pain to combo with its already built-in -1 damage, 2 Caladius Grav Tanks with Arachnus Blaze Cannons, a unit of Custodian Wardens to attach that Blade Champion into, 2 units of Prosecutors to act as utility, plus triple Venerable Contemptor Dreadnoughts, and a Calidus and Eversor Assassin to bring up the rear and shore up those utility units. This is pretty standard stuff for Solar Spearhead. Interesting that we're not really seeing any play from Virtus Praetors this time around, but obviously I know a lot of players swear by the Venerable Contemptor Dreadnoughts, especially in metagames where your opponent doesn't operate in multiple phases particularly well. That's a little hard to find these days since a lot of armies will have the melee counterpunch to kill the Venerable Contemptors after shooting them down, but oftentimes it's so much work to actually get rid of one. It requires 2 unit activations at the very least, and you probably have to trade a unit for them instead of just being able to kill them from range, and that allows you to counterpunch with things like the Blade Champion or the Telamon Heavy Dreadnought, which can do massive damage. Pretty standard stuff from Solar Spearhead, but it is nice to see Adeptus Custodes doing well with it. Feels like they got a lot of press early on after the Grotsmas detachment released about how powerful this was, and we saw some very, very good stats from them early on in the season. However, that has not really materialized too much, and we only see them at the undefeated tables occasionally. Now moving over to Sweden, we have the WoG Master 3, a 31-player GT. This one was won by Magnus Björk, who was rocking Chaos Knights. Now, this Chaos Knight list is pretty standard. In fact, it all fits on one page here. It is a Wardog Stalker with Aura of Terror, 6 Wardog Brigands, and 6 Wardog Carnivores. And that's it. That's the whole list. We didn't take any additional demon allies, no utility to speak of, just running 13 Wardogs and hoping for the best. We've seen this list a million times. It's always been fairly effective, although obviously its effectiveness has dropped off in recent years. But having that massive number of T10 high OC bodies is very difficult for a lot of factions to deal with, and if you get the right set of matchups, you can blow people out pretty hard. So not too surprising that we're seeing this one undefeated. Obviously, congratulations to Magnus Björk for taking down the event with the old Chaos Knights. Now with that, we can move over to Portugal and talk about the Black Hole Wars 2025. This was a 22-player GT and was won by Daniel Moreira running Grey Knights. This was a Warp main task force being led by Brother Captain Stern. He's a very good, just sort of lone character who can wander around, be very difficult to kill since he can respawn himself, so oftentimes it takes 2 phases for your opponent to kill him, and they many times won't even bother. We then have 2 Nemesis Grand Master Dread Knights, a single strike squad, an Interceptor squad. These guys have a lot of really interesting interactions with the detachment ability as well as purgation squads, and we do have 3 purgation squads in the back here, all of those guys rocking side cannons. The technology we can use here is to run up the Interceptors very aggressively. The purgation squads require another Psyker to have line of sight to a target in order to give them indirect fire, but once the Interceptor squad can see a target, you can then unload onto it with the massive number of different purgation squads we have. Fire 12 side cannons at whatever the Interceptor squad can see. Then fire the Interceptors and move them back out of cover to essentially give you a modicum of actual indirect fire on all your purgators. The other thing that Interceptor squads can do is potentially change hallowed ground fairly effectively. You can, for example, move up into an objective at the start of the shooting phase, check your level of control over that objective to give yourself hallowed ground in the middle, and then use their shoot and scoot effects, their fire and fade, to move off that objective into a safer position later and still retain the rerolls for that shooting phase. So a lot of really useful things that we can do with the Interceptors in this detachment. Downside is they're extremely expensive, but obviously if you do have the points for them, they're very, very useful. We then also have 3 standard Nemesis Dread Knights, as well as 2 just 5-man Purifier squads to give ourselves those hallowed ground auras. Pretty interesting list here, focusing very heavily on those Nemesis Dread Knights and the Purgation squads. I don't know if we've quite seen the full Purgation combo played quite so much, which is something that I think a lot of players were very scared of when the detachment came out, but hasn't really been seen so much because it does cost so much. You're in almost 500 points between the Purgation squads and the Interceptor squad, but clearly that was effective since Daniel was able to take down the entire event with this list. Now that moves us over to Cork in Ireland for the Derg Doom 2. This was a 48-player GT, and it was won by Chaos Space Marines. We also had Chaos Demons with another Legion of Excess at 5-0, but again, we've already discussed that detachment in this video, so we're not going to talk about that. But what we will talk about is Tom Mayer with his Creations of Bile. Now, this is the Bile-focused detachment that gives you a random set of mutations on your infantry before the game begins. And a lot of the strategy of using this detachment is constructing it around the potential combinations of benefits that you can gain. This includes Cypher, Fabius Bile, as well as a Chaos Lord with Prime Test subject to grant that Chaos Lord hit rerolls as well as additional damage on his melee weapons, brings that big Demon Hammer to a flat 3 damage on its normal attacks. We then have a Cultist unit, 2 units of 5 Legionnaires, as well as 2 units of Chosen, 1 unit of 10, and 1 unit of 5. Oftentimes we'll see Fabius Bile attach into one of the bigger units. He can blank damage coming into the unit every turn, as well as gives them an additional statistical improvement over top of what they already get from the detachment ability. So that's a pretty natural attachment there. We then have a Nemesis Claw to disrupt enemy stratagem usage in the fight phase. Pretty useful for this melee focused army. We can prevent enemies from doing things like counterattacking or using Armor of Contempt in melee, or other defensive stratagems to really muck with their defensive posture. We have 2 units of Possessed, which synergize incredibly well with the mutations we can give them. 3 Chaos Rhinos to carry around the combination of Legionaries, Chosen, and Nemesis Claws, as well as a Wardog Huntsman and a Wardog Carnivore. Oftentimes we see double Huntsman in this slot. That's kind of the anti-vanilla variety of list. But in this case, we're taking a Carnivore for some more high strength, high AP melee damage. This army tends to have some reasonable strength and AP attacks in melee, but a lot of times we're just going for volume rather than quality. The Carnivore maybe gives us the opportunity to knock down heavy targets by itself, although what we are missing is a lot of shooting from the Huntsman that we would normally see. So the list isn't very shooting oriented. We are just pushing melee up into our opponent's face. But honestly, we don't really need to chill with Creations of Bile. It is so fast and so aggressive and has the potential to hit so hard in melee that you can focus very heavily on melee attacks, and you don't really miss the shooting quite as much as you would in a different variety of Chaos Space Marines. Now with that, we're going to move over to an event near and dear to my heart, the Captain Con 40K event hosted by Away Games. This was a 46-player GT over in Rhode Island in the United States, and I streamed this one. So if you want to go check out recordings from those games, you can do so over on my live tab. Now this one was won, spoiler alert, by Alex Ing running Necrons. Alex was running a Starshatter arsenal and a pretty interesting variety. We see some units that we don't typically see in this detachment being played. This includes, well, first of all, the Silent King. He's not that surprising. He's the biggest and scariest vehicle that you can apply all of the Starshatter buffs to, so you kind of might as well put him in there because you could give him -1 damage, potentially -1 to be wounded, potentially reactive move him to prevent him from getting shot and charged in the same turn. He's just incredibly difficult to deal with in the center of the table. Now, in order to affect him as well, we have a Catacomb Command Barge with a Resurrection Orb, especially powerful because he can give you some more board control by improving your OC characteristic, and he gives you Dread Majesty, so another instance of a reroll once to hit and wound aura, similar to the Silent King's aura, but that allows the Silent King to stay in his ignore modifiers mode for most of the game and still benefit from rerolls as long as the Catacomb Command Barge is nearby. We then also have a Hexmark Destroyer with Chrono Impedance Fields to give -1 damage to the Silent King, and a Scorpec Lord with Demanding Leader to give a vehicle fallback and shoot. Now we have a bunch of utility to upkeep scoring while the Silent King is sort of orbiting around the center of the table. This included 5 Flayed Ones for some forward operation, Ophidian Destroyers for uppy downy, the ability to reach out and score objectives on the opponent's side of the table in the late game, 2 individual Locust Destroyers, as well as a Tomb Blade. We then have some support units as well, a Triarch Stalker to strip cover from enemies, a Canoptech Spider to grant a Feel No Pain to the vehicles, a unit of 3 Scorpec Destroyers to attach in with the Scorpec Lord and act as a melee counterpunch, and then, interestingly, an Annihilation Barge. Now, this guy is a pretty interesting inclusion. He's relatively tough to take down for his cost, and he offers another high-value gun to the army. He can fire his potential sustain to twin-linked Tesla cannon, which gives you another option to knock down some infantry, which can be a little bit of a problem for a Starshatter arsenal. And given the fact that he's relatively efficient and can potentially inflict some additional mortal wounds on top of his shooting, he slots into with the detachment pretty well. Now with that, we're going to move over to the Dice Hammer Open GT number 8. This was in Irvine, California, and had 43 players and was won by Tyranids. We get to talk about some Tyranids on the channel today, which is always exciting. This is Kenneth Onyebor, who was running Crusher Stampede. Very cool to see Crusher Stampede putting up some success. I know there's been a lot of discourse over the kind of like Sam Pope style of Mass Termagants backing up shooting, but in this case, we are electing to take almost literally all monsters. In fact, I think it is literally all monsters. There's 1 Biovore and a Lictor. Otherwise, everything is a monster in this list. Incredibly straightforward. Now, Crusher Stampede obviously gives the monsters the benefit of that OC bonus while they're undamaged, but then giving them bonuses to hit and or wound once they start taking damage. So it makes them very consistent over the entirety of the game, and it makes them pretty good at trading shots with other armies pretty well. We have Old One Eye as the Warlord. That means that we're very limited on Synapse, but we do have access to Shadow in the Warp thanks to the Norn Emissaries, so that's good. But Old One Eye is a absolute beast to take down. He has a Feel No Pain and can regenerate wounds up to 2 times per battle round because he heals in every command phase, which makes him very sticky to remove, and he loves having taken that damage in order to give himself especially +1 to hit on his melee attacks because he's only base weapon skill 3. We then have a Biovore to score secondaries, 3 Exocrines, a Lictor for some additional utility, 1 Maleceptor, 3 Norn Emissaries, no less than 3 Norn Emissaries, I guess. These guys don't get quite as much of a benefit from the +1 to hit out of the detachment ability until they get bracketed. However, the +1 to wound is a pretty big deal for them since they have a lot of attacks, although their base profiles are not that exciting. We then also have 2 Tyrannifexes, both of those with Rupture Cannons, to give ourselves some really punchy, long-range anti-tank shooting. This list is absolutely wild. We have a ton of relatively fast, super high OC from the Norn Emissaries. Yeah, they also have a Feel No Pain baked in, which if they are on their selected objective from Singular Purpose, which is something that the detachment is generally missing. Unlike detachments like Invasion Fleet, we don't have access to a Feel No Pain baked in, so we need to source it somewhere else, and the Emissaries are a pretty good way to run that. And then we have a lot of backline shooting from the Exocrines and aforementioned the Tyrannifexes. Really interesting list this time around. Super cool to see this one. See some success because I think it's super duper rad. This is a style of Tyranids that I really appreciate. I think it's very cool, especially given the fact that these Norn Emissaries can actually leverage their speed in Crusher Stampede now. They have the ability to move through walls, thanks to the trample stratagem that they have in the detachment. So they can actually use their fairly high movement characteristic to get through those walls. And even if they battle shock, for the most part, that doesn't actually really matter so much, since on your own turn, they will retain their OC value when on their Singular Purpose objective, or even getting the bonus OC from being undamaged. So even if they battle shock themselves moving through terrain, it's not actually actually the end of the world, and they can still complete a lot of secondaries just fine. This is a very cool list, and again, it's really cool to see this variety of Tyranids do well. And with that, those are all of the best armies in Warhammer 40k for this week. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. Don't forget to check out Ides of March, and thanks as well to everybody who supports me either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.